The observation chamber was never truly silent. Elias had learned this over 3 months of diplomatic service aboard the Meridian's Hope *. There was always the low hum of environmental processors, the occasional groan of hull plates adjusting to temperature shifts, the whisper of recycled air through ventilation grids. But when Queen Sarith entered a room, something changed in the quality of the quiet. It became expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. She stood at the transparent aluminum viewport now, her silhouette framed against the spiral arms of the Andara Nebula, and Elias found himself doing what he'd been trained specifically not to do. Staring, 3 months, and he still hadn't fully acclimated to the Carith. They looked so devastatingly human that the differences became amplifications rather than distinctions. Sarith's ears swept back from her temples in elegant curves that extended nearly 4 inches beyond where human ears would end, their tips so delicate they seemed to catch and channel the starlight itself. "Dr. Vorn," she didn't turn, "your preliminary analysis of our agricultural exchange proposals." Elias blinked, realizing he'd been mentally composing extremely unprofessional observations about the way her formal robes, some kind of adaptive fabric that shifted between opacity and translucence, caught the nebula's light. He cleared his throat and activated his data tablet, grateful for something concrete to focus on. "The terms are generous, Your Majesty, almost suspiciously so. My superiors are concerned there's a catch we're missing." He scrolled through the documentation, though he'd memorized it days ago. "Carith hydroponic technology is centuries ahead of ours. You're essentially offering to solve Earth's colony food shortage in exchange for cultural exchange programs and artistic collaborations. Is friendship not valuable, Doctor?" Now she did turn, and the smile on her face was the particular one that made his job infinitely more complicated. Not the regal diplomatic smile she wore for the council sessions, but something smaller, more genuine, almost mischievous. "Friendship is priceless," Elias said carefully, "which is why accountants and politicians don't trust it. They're waiting for the invoice." She laughed, actually laughed, her head tilting back slightly, and Elias felt a small, completely inappropriate surge of pride at having caused it. This was the problem with Queen Sarith. In the council chambers, surrounded by advisors and translators, and the full weight of interstellar protocol, she was every inch the ancient sovereign of an empire that had been navigating the stars when humanity was still debating whether fire was a good idea. But in these private consultation sessions, which had somehow become a daily occurrence, she was something else entirely. Someone who appreciated his terrible jokes about diplomatic jargon, who asked unexpected questions about Earth literature, who had once spent an entire hour debating whether coffee or the Carith equivalent, a phosphorescent tea that tasted like thunderstorms, represented the superior caffeinated beverage. "Tell your accountants," Sarith said, moving away from the viewport, "that we already have technology and resources beyond measure. What we lack is novelty, surprise." She picked up a small holographic projector from the side table, and an image of Earth bloomed in the air between them. "Your species is young, chaotic, and gloriously unpredictable. Do you know how rare that is? Most civilizations that reach the stars have long since optimized the spontaneity out of themselves. So we're what? Cosmic entertainment." Elias kept his tone light, but something in the observation stung. "You're fascinating." Sarith's gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his translator implant seem suddenly inadequate, as if there were layers of meaning it couldn't quite capture. "You specifically, Dr. Vorn, have proven particularly diverting." The way she said it sent his internal monologue into mild panic. Was that flirtation, diplomatic maneuvering, both, neither? His training had covered first contact protocols, xenocultural sensitivity, even how to navigate non-carbon-based life forms, radically different concepts of personal space. Nobody had prepared him for an alien queen who looked like every adolescent fantasy of elven royalty, and spoke like She was perpetually 3 words away from either a philosophy lecture or a proposition. "I try to be professionally engaging," he managed, which was possibly the most awkward sentence ever constructed in standard English. Her smile widened. "You succeed admirably." Elias became aware that he'd been thinking something along the lines of "Dear God, even her smile should require a permit," and desperately tried to focus on the agricultural data. The problem was that his mind had always been his worst enemy. It wandered, it editorialized, it provided running commentary on everything happening around him. Usually this was contained safely in his skull. Right now, it was generating increasingly mortifying observations about the precise shade of Sareth's eyes amber, with flecks that might have been gold or might have been their own light source, and the logistics of interspecies attraction protocols. "The hydroponic systems use quantum-locked nutrient distribution," he said loudly, desperately, to his own brain as much as to her. "I'll need to consult with our engineers about implementation, but the initial projections suggest a 300% increase in colony yield within the first growing cycle." Boring but accurate. Sareth moved closer, and Elias caught a scent like ozone and something sweeter, floral but alien. "I didn't ask you here at midnight station time to discuss vegetables, Doctor." Midnight, right. He'd stopped questioning why their meetings drifted later and later into the duty cycle. The official explanation was that it fit her circadian rhythm better. The unofficial truth was that fewer witnesses meant fewer diplomatic incident reports. "What did you want to discuss?" Elias asked, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. Sareth's expression shifted into something harder to read. Her head tilted slightly, those remarkable ears adjusting in a way that reminded him of animals tracking sound, and for just a moment her eyes seemed to lose focus. "I wanted to ask if you were always this loud." "I'm sorry." Elias glanced around the observation chamber, suddenly worried his voice carried more than he thought. "I can speak more quietly if—" "Not your voice, Doctor." Sareth's gaze refocused on him with laser precision. "Your thoughts." The environmental processors hummed. The hull plates settled. Recycled air whispered through ventilation grids, and Elias realized he'd stopped breathing entirely. "That was a joke," Sareth said into the stretching silence, but her smile had acquired an edge that definitely hadn't been there before. "You humans appreciate humor, yes. I've been studying your comedy protocols. Perhaps I need more practice." "Right," Elias said. "Yes, funny, you got me." But later, after he'd returned to his quarters and lay staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed every moment of the conversation, he couldn't shake the memory of her expression when she'd said it. The way her smile hadn't quite reached her eyes. The way she'd known exactly when his thoughts had turned unprofessional, even though he'd been absolutely certain nothing had shown on his face. Elias had never considered himself paranoid, but 3 days of cataloging coincidences had turned him into a conspiracy theorist with a color-coded spreadsheet. He sat in his quarters at 400 station time, surrounded by floating holographic annotations that made the room look like a detective's evidence board designed by someone having a mild breakdown. "Okay," he muttered to his empty cabin, "let's review the madness." The first incident, council meeting, day 73. Ambassador Reeves had been mid-sentence about resource allocation when Sareth responded to the argument he was clearly building toward, the one he hadn't actually made yet. Elias had assumed she'd simply read the room better than everyone else. Logical. Second incident, day 76. Private consultation. Elias had been about to ask whether Kareth children experienced adolescent rebellion when Sareth launched into a surprisingly detailed explanation of teenage Kareth sneaking out to attend unauthorized music gatherings. He'd convinced himself he was just that predictable. Third incident, yesterday. The one that had triggered his current spiral into amateur investigation. He'd been standing behind Sareth during a ceremonial function, bored out of his mind, mentally composing a message to his sister that began, "Dear Maya, I have attended my 200th alien ribbon-cutting ceremony, and I want to die. And Sarith had turned, caught his eye, and winked. She'd winked at a thought. This is insane, Elias told his floating annotations. You're inventing patterns because the alternative is admitting you're terrible at hiding your expressions. Except he'd been practicing his diplomatic face since graduate school. He'd once sat through a 4-hour lecture on pre-Columbian pottery techniques without betraying his internal screaming. He knew when his face was revealing things. He pulled up the surveillance debugging protocol on his workstation and ran it for the 5th time. The Meridian's Hope was equipped with standard monitoring systems, nowhere private except personal quarters, and even those were supposed to be sacrosanct under Earth-Carith privacy agreements. The scan came back clean. No hidden cameras, no unauthorized sensors, no exotic radiation signatures that might indicate observation technology beyond his understanding. Elias slumped in his chair and rubbed his eyes. The rational explanation was that he was losing his mind. The isolation of deep space, the pressure of being humanity's diplomatic representative, the fact that he'd been having increasingly vivid dreams about a woman who technically wasn't even the same species, all perfectly reasonable causes for mild paranoia. The irrational explanation was so much worse. He pulled up the Carith cultural database and entered search parameters he'd been avoiding for days: perception, telepathy, mind reading, neural, psychic. The database was extensive. 3 months of cultural exchange had produced terabytes of information, but most of it was practical. Agriculture, engineering, art, music, social hierarchies. He had to dig through 17 layers of cross-referenced anthropological studies before he found the reference. It was buried in a linguistics file, almost a footnote. The resonance, archaic Carith term for the perception of electromagnetic thought patterns, historical rather than contemporary significance. See also, evolutionary adaptation to low-atmosphere communication challenges. Elias sat very still. Then he searched for low atmosphere and Carith evolution. The next file included anatomical studies. The Carith homeworld had substantially thinner atmosphere than Earth. Sound traveled poorly, especially across the vast distances of their ancient, sprawling city-states. They developed enhanced auditory systems as compensation, but the real adaptation was more subtle. Their nervous systems, particularly in certain individuals, had evolved sensitivity to the electromagnetic fields generated by neural activity. The elaborate ears weren't just for sound, they were receivers for something deeper. "Oh," Elias said to his empty room. "Oh no." His cabin door chimed. At 4:30 in the morning, he nearly fell out of his chair. "Dr. Vorn." Sarith's voice through the comm system, carefully neutral. "I apologize for the hour. Might I speak with you?" Elias looked at his evidence board of paranoia, looked at the anatomical files still glowing on his screen, and made the ill-advised decision that had characterized most of his academic career. He needed to know. "Come in," he said, and authorized the door to open. Sarith entered wearing something less formal than her usual attire, a simple wrap that suggested she'd been sleeping, or at least trying to. Her hair was loose, and her ears were slightly flattened back, which he'd learned indicated either aggression or distress. Given that she looked exhausted rather than angry, he was betting on the latter. "You've been researching," she said, and it wasn't a question. "That depends." Elias gestured at his holographic conspiracy board. "Have you been reading my mind?" The silence stretched for several seconds. Then Sarith did something he'd never seen before. She looked genuinely embarrassed. "Not reading exactly," she said. "It's more like overhearing. When someone shouts in a crowded room, you can't help but notice." "I wasn't shouting. I was thinking privately, in my own head." "Yes, well." Sarith moved further into the room, her ears swiveling slightly as if tracking sounds he couldn't hear. "Your thoughts are particularly loud, electromagnetically speaking. Most humans are background noise, scattered static. You're more like a radio broadcast." Elias opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. How long? Since we met. She had the grace to look apologetic. Initially, I thought it was standard neural activity, elevated because you were nervous. But over time, I realized you just think that way, constantly, vividly, with extensive commentary. Oh God, Elias put his head in his hands. What have you heard? Everything, Sareth said simply. Your homesickness, your sister's messages that make you laugh and cry simultaneously, your imposter syndrome about this posting, your analytical breakdowns of Kareth poetry, your increasingly creative profanity when Ambassador Reeves speaks, she paused delicately, other observations. Elias felt heat flooding his face. The thing about the ribbon ceremony. Among others, yes. And the other things. Dr. Vorn, I am 347 years old. I've been the subject of attraction before. It's not unwelcome. Her lips quirked. Though your internal monologue about whether interspecies relationships require additional paperwork was particularly endearing. Despite everything, Elias laughed. It came out slightly unhinged. This is a nightmare. This is literally my nightmare. I've been mentally undressing you in diplomatic meetings. Technically, you've been mentally redressing *me in several variations of Earth historical costume. The Victorian-era one was elaborate. I'm going to request immediate transfer back to Earth and never leave my apartment again. Sareth sat down across from him, and her expression shifted into something more serious. I didn't come here to humiliate you, Elias. I came because tonight I couldn't sleep, and I realized I've been unfair. You didn't know about the resonance. You've been operating under the assumption of privacy you didn't actually have, and I've been. She gestured vaguely, eavesdropping essentially. Can you turn it off? No more than you can choose not to hear when someone speaks. Her ears flattened further. My entire life is other people's thoughts bleeding through. Most Kareth generate minimal electromagnetic signature. We evolved to be quiet in that spectrum. But humans, especially humans like you, are different. Louder, more chaotic. Is that why you keep scheduling private meetings? Elias asked. Because I'm entertainment, a novelty broadcast. No. Sareth leaned forward, and for once her ancient, regal composure cracked slightly. Because for 300 years, I've been surrounded by silence. Careful, controlled, diplomatically appropriate silence. And then you arrived, with your absurd thoughts about whether our tea tastes like thunderstorms and your sister's terrible puns and your genuine wonder at nebulae, and it was like. She struggled for words, like music after centuries of nothing but metronomes. Elias stared at her. His mind was racing. He could feel it generating thoughts, broadcasting them, and now he was hyper-aware of every mental tangent. He tried to focus, tried to think clearly, but all that came through was a confused jumble of asterisk. This is insane, and she's been lonely, and I've been essentially naked this entire time. Sareth smiled, tired but real. Yes to all of those, particularly the last one, though I'd argue it's more interesting than embarrassing. I'm going to need so much therapy. I can recommend an excellent Kareth specialist in cross-species psychological adjustment. Do they charge extra for patients whose alien queen has been eavesdropping on their sexual fantasies? Probably. Despite everything, Elias found himself smiling. Then the smile faded as a more serious thought occurred. The council meetings, the negotiations, have you been using this, reading the other diplomats? Sareth's expression went carefully neutral. That's a conversation for later, when you've had time to process this and decide whether you can continue working with me knowing what you now know. She stood to leave, and Elias realized he should let her go, should demand time and space and a dozen explanations. Instead he said, the Victorian dress was pale blue, with those ridiculous leg-of-mutton sleeves. Sareth paused at the door and looked back at him. I know, and you were wondering whether I could dance. Can you? Come to the cultural exchange gala next week and find out. Her smile was back, the mischievous one that had started this entire complicated mess. Try not to think too loudly about it in the meantime. I need some sleep. After she left, Elias sat alone with his conspiracy board and the sudden, undeniable knowledge that his mind had never been his own private space. It should have felt like violation. Instead, inexplicably, it felt like the beginning of something entirely new. The cultural exchange gala was exactly as tedious as Elias had feared, with the added psychological torture of knowing that Sarith could hear his running commentary on every moment of it. He stood near one of the refreshment stations, nursing something purple that allegedly contained alcohol, and tried very hard not to think about how Ambassador Reeves's formal attire made him look like a decorative cushion that had gained sentience and delusions of importance. He failed immediately, and across the ballroom Sarith's shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. This is impossible, Elias thought deliberately, testing the boundaries of their connection. How am I supposed to function knowing you can hear everything? Sarith was engaged in conversation with a cluster of Kareth dignitaries, but one of her ears swiveled slightly in his direction. She didn't look at him, but a moment later his comm implant buzzed with a private text message. The same way you function knowing I can see your face. You adapt. Elias typed back, faces lie, thoughts don't. Exactly. Refreshing, isn't it? He wanted to argue, but 3 days of hyper-awareness had taught him something uncomfortable. She was right. There was something almost liberating about the complete inability to hide. No more exhausting diplomatic masks. No more carefully constructed responses. No more wondering if he'd said the wrong thing because she already knew what he meant before he'd finished stumbling through the words. Of course, it also meant she knew that he'd spent an embarrassing amount of time the previous evening reviewing Kareth courtship customs, and then immediately thinking why am I researching this? We're not courting. This is a diplomatic assignment. I'm a professional on loop, for approximately 40 minutes. Her response, delivered via text at 2 in the morning, had been simple. The answer is flowers, though ours are bioluminescent. Also, you are overthinking. Also, go to sleep. But now, watching her navigate the political complexities of the gala with practiced grace, Elias found himself thinking about what she'd revealed in his quarters. 347 years of other people's carefully controlled silence. He'd done the math. She'd been navigating interstellar politics since before Earth had figured out radio transmission. The loneliness of that was staggering. Stop pitying me, her voice echoed in his calm. I can hear that too, and it's tedious. He looked up, found her gaze across the room, and thought as clearly as he could. Not pity, empathy. There's a difference. Her expression softened slightly before she returned to her conversation. Elias was just considering whether he could escape to a quieter corner when Ambassador Reeves materialized beside him like a particularly unwelcome conjuration. Dr. Vorn, you've been spending quite a bit of time with Her Majesty lately. It's my job, Elias said carefully. Reeves had the political instincts of a territorial predator and the personal charm of a tax audit. Your job is to provide linguistic and cultural consultation, not to monopolize the Kareth Queen's private schedule. Reeves smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Elias think of creatures with too many teeth. Some members of the delegation are concerned about the appropriateness of your proximity. Elias felt his jaw tighten. If there are concerns about my professional conduct, they should be filed through proper channels. But, oh, I'm sure your conduct is impeccable. Reeves took a sip of his own purple beverage. But appearances matter in diplomacy. We wouldn't want anyone to think Earth's interests are being compromised by personal entanglements. The implied threat was clear, and Elias felt anger spike through his thoughts before he could control it. Reeves was an officious bureaucrat who'd spent the entire mission trying to undermine anyone with actual expertise, and now he was. Sarith appeared between them, with the fluid grace of someone who'd been crossing ballrooms for centuries. Ambassador Reeves, how fortunate. I've been hoping to discuss your proposal for the mining rights negotiation. Reeves's expression transformed into obsequious delight. "Your Majesty, I'd be honored. In private, I think." Sareth's smile was pleasant and absolutely merciless. "Dr. Vorn, would you excuse us? I believe the Kareth String Ensemble is about to perform. You mentioned an interest in our musical traditions." It wasn't a suggestion. Elias nodded and escaped toward the performance area, his mind still churning with irritation. Behind him, he caught fragments of Sareth's voice, her tone still pleasant but with an edge that suggested Reeves was about to have a very uncomfortable conversation. The ensemble was already playing when a Kareth woman approached him. She was young, at least by Kareth standards, with ears decorated in intricate silver jewelry that chimed softly with her movements. "You're Dr. Vorn," she said. It wasn't a question. "Guilty, and you are." "Veeth, I'm one of Her Majesty's cultural advisors." She studied him with unconcealed curiosity. "You're the human she can hear." Elias nearly choked on his drink. That's common knowledge. Among those close to the Queen, yes. The resonance is rare even among our people, perhaps 1 in 10,000, for it to work across species. Veeth's ears tilted forward with interest. "Unprecedented. You must be generating extraordinary electromagnetic activity." "Apparently I think loudly. It's my most marketable skill." Veeth laughed. "Her Majesty speaks of you often. Your mind fascinates her. The chaos, the creativity, the constant motion of your thoughts. Most Kareth who possess the resonance find it overwhelming, isolating, but you've made her less alone." She paused, then added quietly, "We're grateful for that." Before Elias could formulate a response that wasn't deeply embarrassing, the music shifted into something more complex, and Veeth excused herself. He stood listening to the alien harmonics, thinking about loneliness and connection, and the strange accident of biology that had turned his overactive mind into something valuable rather than simply exhausting. When Sareth rejoined him 20 minutes later, she looked satisfied in a way that suggested Reeves had learned several important lessons about overstepping. "Did you destroy him?" Elias asked. "Merely educated him on the proper channels for filing complaints about perceived diplomatic impropriety, which, coincidentally, all route through my personal office." She accepted a drink from a passing server. "He won't trouble you again." "You didn't need to do that." "Yes, I did." Sareth's gaze was direct, intense in the way that still made his pulse quicken. "Your ambassador believes humans can be intimidated into submission through political maneuvering. He needed to understand that in Kareth culture, attempting to separate a queen from her chosen advisor is considered a profound insult." "Chosen advisor," Elias repeated. "Is that what I am?" "Among other things." She gestured toward the dance floor, where couples were beginning to move to the ensemble's more rhythmic piece. "You were wondering if I could dance. This is your opportunity to find out. Here now, in front of everyone." Scared Dr. Vorn. He was, actually. Not of the dancing. He'd taken formal dance lessons as part of his diplomatic training, though Kareth movements were probably different. He was scared of what it would mean, of the statement it would make, of the way his heart was currently broadcasting what felt like a minor cardiac event directly into her perception. Sareth's expression softened. "We can return to the refreshment area if you prefer. I won't push you into discomfort for the sake of proving a point." Instead, Elias found himself offering his hand. "One dance. But if I embarrass both our species, I'm blaming you." "Acceptable terms." Her hand was warm in his, her fingers longer than human proportions, but fitting against his palm like they'd been designed for exactly this purpose. She led him to the floor, and as the music swelled, Elias discovered that Kareth dancing was less about complex steps and more about response, reading your partner's movements, adapting, flowing. It should have been impossible. He had no training in this style, no cultural framework. But Sareth could hear his intentions before he executed them, could sense the split-second decision to turn or step or pull closer. And he, in turn, found himself reading her with an accuracy that had nothing to do with the resonance and everything to do with 3 months of learning her expressions, her gestures, the minute tells that revealed her thoughts. They moved through the music like a conversation, and Elias realized this was what they'd been doing all along. Talking without words, understanding without explanation, connecting across the gap between species through nothing more than attention and intention. When the music ended, they were standing closer than diplomatic protocol strictly allowed, and the ballroom had gone noticeably quiet. Elias became aware that they'd attracted an audience, human and Kareth both, watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation to, in Ambassador Reeves's case, barely concealed horror. "We've created a scandal," Elias thought, and Sareth's lips curved into a smile. "Good," she said aloud. "Scandals are far more interesting than agricultural negotiations." Later, back in his quarters, Elias finally allowed himself to think the question he'd been avoiding. What exactly are we doing? The response came through his calm almost immediately. Something unprecedented. Something complicated. Something neither of us can walk away from even if we wanted to. Sleep well, Elias. Tomorrow we negotiate with the Outer Colonies delegation, and I'll need your thoughts sharp. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind broadcasting a confused jumble of anxiety and exhilaration, and the persistent image of Sareth's smile when they danced. Somewhere in the royal quarters, he knew she could hear all of it. The strangest part was that he didn't mind anymore. The Kareth Technology Division occupied a section of the Meridian's hope that always made Elias vaguely uncomfortable, filled with devices that hummed at frequencies he could almost but not quite perceive. Dr. Sherv, the chief neurotechnologist, was examining him with equipment that looked like it belonged in both a medical bay and a physics laboratory simultaneously. "Fascinating," Sherv murmured, studying a holographic display of Elias' neural activity. "Your electromagnetic output is approximately 40% higher than baseline human readings. No wonder Her Majesty finds you so audible." Elias sat very still in the scanning chair, trying not to think about how exposed this felt. Trying and of course failing. Can you reduce it, dampen it somehow? Theoretically, yes. Sherv manipulated the hologram, highlighting clusters of neural activity. "We could install a dampening field generator, quite small, subcutaneous implant behind your ear. It would create electromagnetic interference that would render your thoughts essentially invisible to resonance perception. No side effects. Minimal. Slight headache for the first week during calibration. Possible minor disruption to your comm implant until we adjust frequencies." Sherv looked at him curiously. "May I ask why you're requesting this? Her Majesty seems quite content with the current arrangement." That was the question, wasn't it? Elias had spent the past week considering it from every angle. The privacy argument was obvious. Every human being deserved the sanctity of their own thoughts. The professional argument was sound. Diplomatic negotiations shouldn't be compromised by one party having telepathic advantages. The personal argument was the one that kept him awake. How could any relationship be genuine when one person couldn't hide anything? "Professional concerns," Elias said finally. "The upcoming Alliance summit with the Outer Colonies delegation. If Queen Sareth can read their thoughts, it creates an unfair advantage that could undermine the legitimacy of any agreements." Sherv nodded slowly. "A valid concern. I'll prepare the device. You can decide whether to use it when the time comes." 2 days later, Elias stood in the diplomatic chamber with the dampener in a small case in his pocket, watching the Outer Colonies delegation file in. They were Kareth separatists, colonies that had broken from the Empire centuries ago and were now seeking to renegotiate trade agreements. The tension in the room was palpable: old grievances, territorial disputes, the complicated politics of a civilization spread across dozens of star systems. Sareth sat at the head of the table, regal and composed, and when her eyes found Elias, she tilted her head slightly. A question. He touched his pocket where the dampener case rested, and her ears flattened minutely. Understanding. The negotiations began badly and deteriorated from there. The outer colony's representative, a stern woman named Keith, opened with demands that were clearly designed to provoke rather than persuade. Sareth responded with diplomatic precision, but Elias could see the frustration building in the set of her shoulders, the minute adjustments of her ears. Then Keith said something in formal Kareth, a phrase Elias' translator struggled with, and Sareth's entire posture changed. She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a register that Elias had learned meant danger. "You dare accuse the throne of—" "Your Majesty," Elias interrupted, which was a breach of protocol but necessary. Perhaps a brief recess would be beneficial. Allow both parties to reconsider their opening positions. Sareth looked at him, and for a moment he saw genuine anger in her expression. Then slowly it faded. "A wise suggestion, Dr. Vorn, 20 minutes. In the private antechamber, Sareth paced like something caged. "They're lying. Every word from Keith's mouth is a calculated deception. She's broadcasting fear and desperation, but her words are all aggression and demands. They're in a worse position than they're admitting, and they're hoping to leverage our desire for peace into concessions they don't deserve." "You can hear all that." "Of course I can. It's why these negotiations were even possible. They know I can sense deception, so they came prepared to be honest." She stopped pacing and looked at him directly. "Except Keith is trying to lie anyway, which means she's either foolish or there's something deeper happening. Something she's willing to risk exposure to hide." Elias thought about the dampener in his pocket, thought about fairness and ethical negotiations and the principle of equal footing. Then he thought about Sareth's comment. "They know I can sense deception, so they came prepared to be honest." The resonance wasn't a secret advantage, it was part of the known framework of these discussions. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Talk to Keith's attaché, the younger one, Vyarth. He's been quiet, but his thoughts are loud with concern. Find out what they're really afraid of." Elias found Vyarth in the observation lounge, staring out at the nebula with the expression of someone contemplating catastrophe. The young Kareth started when Elias approached, his ears swiveling defensively. "I'm not here officially," Elias said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Just one perpetually confused human trying to understand what's actually happening in there." Vyarth studied him warily. "You're the one Her Majesty can hear, the human with the loud thoughts. Guilty, which means I'm terrible at deception, so you can trust that I genuinely want to help." Elias leaned against the viewport. "Your delegation is afraid of something. Something bad enough that you're willing to antagonize the most powerful political entity in this sector. That's not rational unless the alternative is worse." Silence stretched between them. Then Vyarth said quietly, "Pirates. Well, not pirates exactly. A warlord faction that's been raiding outer colony supply lines for the past year. We're losing resources faster than we can replace them, and if we admit weakness to the throne—" He gestured helplessly. "The Empire has been waiting for us to fail, to prove that separation was a mistake. We can't give them that satisfaction, even if it means starving. Pride is expensive." Vyarth's ears flattened in misery. "Keith thinks she can negotiate better terms without admitting our vulnerability. I think she's wrong, but I'm not the senior diplomat." Elias returned to the antechamber where Sareth was reviewing documents and explained what he'd learned. She listened without interruption, her expression shifting from anger to calculation to something that might have been satisfaction. "So they're desperate but too proud to admit it, which means they're negotiating from false strength. If I call them on it, they lose face. If I don't, we waste time on posturing." She looked at Elias. "What would you do? Give them a way to save face? Offer military support against the warlord faction as part of the trade agreement? Frame it as mutual defense rather than assistance to failing colonies? And they accept help without admitting weakness." Sareth smiled. Sometimes I forget how useful it is to have a mind I can consult without anyone else overhearing. Your perspective is valuable precisely because it's different from ours. When negotiations resumed, Sareth proposed exactly that arrangement, and Elias watched Keith's posture transform from defensive aggression to cautious relief. The discussions continued for hours, but the fundamental shift had occurred. By the time they adjourned for the evening, the framework of a genuine agreement was taking shape. In his quarters that night, Elias sat with the dampener case open on his desk. The device was elegant in its simplicity, a small disk of technology that would grant him the privacy he'd thought he wanted. All he had to do was install it. His calm chimed. Sareth's voice, tired but pleased. "Thank you for today. Your insight about pride and desperation was exactly what I needed. You would have figured it out eventually. Perhaps, but having someone to think through problems with, someone whose thoughts I can hear without political filters." She paused. "It's become rather essential." Elias picked up the dampener, feeling its weight. "Sheriff gave me the device. I could install it tonight, be completely private by morning." The silence stretched long enough that he wondered if she'd ended the connection. "Then is that what you want?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. "Part of me wants the privacy back. The ability to have thoughts that are just mine without worrying about what you're hearing. But another part of me has gotten used to this. The complete honesty. The way we can communicate without words. The fact that you laugh at my terrible internal jokes about Ambassador Reeves looking like sentient furniture. He does, though. The resemblance is uncanny." Elias laughed despite himself. "This shouldn't work. This bizarre accident of biology that means you can hear my every thought. It should be invasive and uncomfortable and wrong. But somehow it's become." He struggled for the right word. "Intimate," Sareth supplied. "In a way that has nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with genuine understanding. I've spent centuries with people who showed me carefully curated versions of themselves. You can't do that. Every petty annoyance, every moment of wonder, every ridiculous tangent your mind takes, I hear all of it, and it's extraordinary." Elias closed the dampener case. "What if I want to surprise you sometimes? Plan something without you hearing it in advance. Then think in Russian. Your file indicates you speak it fluently, and I never learned. Or better yet, collaborate with my staff. Can help you plan surprises I won't overhear." He could hear the smile in her voice. "Although I should warn you that your thoughts about what constitutes a romantic gesture are adorably earnest and would absolutely work on me. You're hearing that right now, aren't you? Every word." The part about bioluminescent flowers was particularly sweet. Elias groaned but found himself smiling. He stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the Endara Nebula. Somewhere in the royal quarters, he knew Sareth was probably doing the same thing, and his thoughts drifted to the strange journey that had brought him here. 3 months ago, he'd been a nervous xenolinguist terrified of making diplomatic mistakes. Now he was someone who'd learned that true connection required vulnerability. That intimacy meant accepting rather than hiding. That sometimes the most profound relationships came from complete inability to pretend. "I'm keeping my loud thoughts," he decided, broadcasting it clearly. "All of them, even the embarrassing ones." Sareth's response came immediately. "Especially the embarrassing ones. They're my favorite." Later, much later, Elias submitted his official report on the Outer Colonies negotiation. In it, he noted the successful framework agreement, the military cooperation protocols, and the cultural exchange programs that would follow. He did not mention telepathy, electromagnetic perception, or the fact that Earth's diplomatic success had been built on a connection that existed outside any protocol manual. Some things didn't need to be explained to people who couldn't understand them. Ambassador Reeves complained, of course, filed formal protests about inappropriate relationships and compromised objectivity. The complaints were routed through Sareth's office and disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. Elias learned to think in Russian when planning surprises. He learned which of his thoughts made Sareth laugh, and which ones made her contemplative, and which ones, occasionally, made her ears flush slightly darker, and what he'd learned was the Kareth equivalent of a blush. And Sarith, for her part, learned that loneliness could be cured by connection, that chaos could be beautiful, and that sometimes the loudest thoughts were the ones most worth hearing. The dampening device stayed in its case, a reminder of the choice Elias had made, to remain fully, vulnerably, impossibly himself. It was, they both agreed, the best decision he'd ever broadcast.